The Nintendo 64 is a game console that made a huge impact on the industry. Sure, it's not celebrated for its diversity or offering up a massive library of games, but some of the top games for the hardware are amongst the most influential ever. I'm of course talking about the likes of Super Mario Bros. 64, which pretty much functioned not only as the blueprint for 3D mascot-based platformers, but a large portion of games featuring polygonal-based graphics as a whole. Then we of course have the amazing Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time, a video game that would be celebrated as the most critically acclaimed title that has ever been produced. To write the Nintendo 64's relevance off would be extremely ignorant. Due to great games like the ones that we have just mentioned, the Nintendo 64 has enough positives going for it that it will never be forgotten. But what fewer people will be aware of is that there is a point in time where this technology was not intended to be used in a Nintendo console, but within a Sega manufactured one instead. So let's explore this wacky chapter in gaming history and discuss this deeper. So without further ado, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of the Sega Ultra 64. Yeah! To start today's tale off, let me take you back to the early 90s, a period whereby the gaming hardware landscape is a very different place to what it is as of now, with the fabled 16-bit console war taking place between Japanese juggernauts Sega and Nintendo. This battle that had originally been declared in Japan had now spilt out into other territories, with the most vital skirmish taking place over in the United States. Here, in a region that had been dominated by Nintendo for quite some time, the tides had finally turned, and Sega with their Genesis was finally on top. This was largely in part due to the genius marketing and product positioning that was implemented by the staff working at Sega America, with the legendary Tom Kalinske at the helm. As innovative as this marketing was, Sega, like Nintendo now, swept America. Gaming was clearly now in demand, which would lead to companies internally within the country beginning to take notice. One of these companies would be California-based Silicon Graphics, a company that had been founded by an individual known as Jim Clark back in 1981. For much of SGI's existence, the company focused on 3D imaging and creating 3D graphics computer workstations. In 1992, the company's reigning CEO, Ed McCracken, would observe the ongoing console war taking place, but would take note that the majority of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games were still in rudimentary 2D, even though the technology existed for Nintendo and Sega to be putting out much more technologically cutting-edge games. McCracken would surmise that for 3D polygonal gaming to become popular on home consoles, a chip would need to be created that would cost far less than anything that currently existed. The average consumer would need to be able to afford a system in the first place if they were to be successful in the mass market. So he would set his engineers on a mission to create a chip that both consumed less power and cost far less than what they had currently available, eventually resulting in a chip that only cost $40, which was 5 times cheaper than what SGI were currently selling their processors for at that time. Past this point, Silicon Graphics would draw up plans for a video game console, so that they could take them to pitch to one of the major console manufacturers. The obvious choice here was of course Nintendo and Sega. Silicon Graphics opted to pass on Nintendo on the basis that their technology, advanced graphics, did not seem to fit in line with what Nintendo was trying to do. After all, this was the same company who had made a success of releasing the Game Boy, a cheap, budget, monochrome system that had been designed by Gunpei Yokoi, who has gone on record to state that Nintendo's way of adapting technology is not to look for the state of the art, but to utilise mature technology that can be mass-produced cheaply, so Nintendo didn't seem like a good match. Sega would seem to be much more suitable fit for Silicon Graphics, as the company were demonstrating that they were pushing the envelope in more ways than one. For example, SGI had taken note that the company had released the Sega Mega CD, a CD-ROM based console add-on that offered additional CPU and a custom graphics chip, so a lust for more horsepower was certainly there. Pair all of this with the fact that they had seen Sega America take the country by storm, with marketing claiming that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, Tom Kalinske seemed like the perfect businessman for Silicon Graphics to get in touch with. Regarding this, Kalinske states, "We have been contacted by Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics Incorporated, who called us up one day and said that he had just bought a company called MIPS Incorporated, which had been working on some things with some great research and development people, and it just so happened that they came up with a chip that they thought would be great for a video game console. We told them that in the US we don't really design consoles, we do the software, but it sounded interesting and we would come over and take a look at it." So that is exactly what Sega of America did. Kalinske and company would be thoroughly impressed with the technology that SGI would demonstrate, so Kalinske would decide to call his superiors over in Japan so that they could send over the hardware team to take a closer look. Sega of Japan would agree to the visit and would show up stateside to see what Silicon Graphics had on offer. Kalinske states that on this international visit, the Japanese team was led by the company's senior vice president of hardware, but upon reviewing the chipset, the Japanese team would look completely stone-faced, refusing to give any reaction whatsoever. But after the inspection had concluded, the vice president would state that the chip was kind of interesting, but was too big in manufacturing terms, and would bring a lot of minor technical things to the table that he didn't like about the hardware. He would also criticise the audio and frame rate, claiming it simply was not up to scratch. Sega of Japan rejecting ideas brought to the table by Sega of America. Who would have thought, eh? Not me. Still, the dream was not dead for SGI quite yet, so they would go back to the drawing board quite literally to improve what they had on offer. Staff at the company would tirelessly work to resolve each of the issues that Sega of Japan have brought up, eventually resulting in a more refined product that was capable of reaching Sega's needs. Kalinske would get Sega of Japan to agree to come back, with this time even Sega chairman and CEO Hayao Nakayama coming along to see what had been created. A second review would take place, but sadly for the Americans, the Japanese would insist that SGI simply wasn't good enough. A rejected and deflated Jim Clark would speak to Tom Kalinske, not having a clue what to do next, as in his mind, SGI had spent all of their time and effort on what they considered the perfect video game chipset. Already familiar with the stubbornness of Sega of Japan, Kalinske would try to let Clark down gently, telling him that there were video game companies who would like the chip, that he should be calling because Sega wasn't one of them. Despite Silicon Graphics' early reservations regarding Nintendo, they were more open to ideas than the California company expected, the meeting taking place between the two entities in 1993. In fact, Nintendo loved the technology that Sega had rejected and ordered it to be improved multiple times, and was even more impressed with how cheap the tech was compared to other 3D hardware. On August 23rd, 1993, the companies announced a global joint development and licensing agreement surrounding Project Reality, projecting that the yet unnamed product would be developed specifically for Nintendo, would be unveiled in arcades in 1994, and would be available for home use by late 1995, below $250. This announcement coincided with Nintendo's August 1993 Shoshinkai trade show. As we know, Project Reality would become the Ultra 64, which would later be known as the Nintendo 64, with the arcade games in question being the likes of Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA. Arcade cabinets would essentially try and function as Ultra 64 demos before the home console later arrived. Looking back at this town, Nintendo would certainly win this round, as the Nintendo 64 would be over 3 times more popular than the Sega Saturn, with the Nintendo 64 selling 33 million units, dwarfing the Saturn's 9 million. Now, looking back at these events, poor Tom Kalinske of Sega of America seems to have been let down by Sega of Japan on multiple occasions, with him leaving the company in 1996 due to perceiving the Sega Saturn to have poor architecture, believing that no one could successfully market that console in the United States. For him, it has to be all the more frustrating to have both the key competitors' technology within his grasp, as not only did he work with Silicon Graphics, encouraging them to refine the Nintendo 64 technology, but as we may cover on here in the future, he also had meetings with Sony proposing that they make a joint console together. Sega of Japan would throw both a Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation technology to the curb, thinking that they would make more money with the Saturn. History now shows us that Sega would finish third place that console generation, but one subtle change in events could have led us down a rabbit hole of receiving a very different gaming past. Nights into Dreams on the 64, anyone? Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, I urge you to check out my recent video on the Sega Neptune. Yeah, cheerio.